Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mazzoro, and today we're going to talk about that breach of plant evolutionary history that's right in the middle, 300 to 200 million years ago. And this is actually going to be familiar to some of you because you'll notice that right about 200 million years ago is Pangaea. Right about 200 million years ago is that time of dinosaurs. So we're going to go from the pre-dinosaur age into plants and what happens with plants when dinosaurs actually get here, right? This middle period. And we're going to cover three things when we do it. The first thing we're going to talk about is how the Earth changed as soon as gymnosperms arrived. We have bryophytes at first, then we had ferns in the last lesson, so now we're finally going to have cone plants coming on the scene. And they're actually going to physically change the Earth, a lot like ferns did, creating soil, and a lot like bryophytes did, changing the air and making less carbon dioxide and more oxygen in the air. And then you're going to see that cone plants, gymnosperms, they basically take over, not only because they have defensive advantages over all other plants at that time, but also because they have reproductive advantages over all other plants from that time. So really, here's your graph that we're looking at. Here's that 100 million year span. And what you're going to notice is you're going to notice that O2 is going to start really high and begin to actually decline. CO2 is going to go up slightly. And especially what you're going to notice is the number of gymnosperms rockets up. And there becomes more gymnosperms than even spore plants on the planet. They are really, really, really successful. So let's talk about why. So gymnosperms were really the first trees, and the evidence of the first trees is right here in Yonge Basin in Nova Scotia, and if you don't know where Nova Scotia is, it's up in Canada right up here. Yonge Basin has these fossils in it. They're fossils of what any biologist would recognize as clearly a fossilized tree, a prehistoric forest. These trees are called lepidodendron trees, and these were the first trees on Earth. Gymnosperms were the first true trees to actually grow, the first true huge plants. And that caused O2 initially to go up and CO2 initially to go down. That had a lot of really interesting effects on the Earth. So here's what the Earth looks like at this time, right? Lots of tall trees sprouting out, still lots of ferns, and all that oxygen in the air actually fuels insect size growth. And what you get is you get this kind of prehistoric time that's so often referred to in a lot of cartoons and stuff like this, that prehistoric time where you see these gigantic insects and gigantic dragonflies flying around. That actually happened. This is the actual size of a roly-poly from this time 300 million years ago, the actual size of a dragonfly as opposed to a dragonfly today. These insects grow abnormally large because of the amount of oxygen that the first trees, gymnosperms, cone plants, are pumping into the air. Also, what's really important is that this is the time when you have the very, very first dinosaurs. And those dinosaurs are large and they're hungry. And they're going to start eating those plants. And as soon as dinosaurs, these gigantic beasts, start eating these first gymnosperms, it causes gymnosperms plants, it puts a pressure on them to actually start developing defenses. Stuff like thorns, stuff like poison sap. Here's some gymnosperms that are even still around today. They're cycads. They were the most popular gymnosperm on Earth at this time. And what you'll note about cycads is they have this cone in the middle, but if you go to eat this cone, it's logged with super poisonous sap that can take down large animals. And they're leaves, if you zoom in real close, they're actually needles, so it would actually physically hurt to eat them. So it was grazing dinosaurs that actually caused plants to develop thorns and poison sap and all these defenses that we just kind of take for granted now. Defenses like caffeine, chemical defenses like nicotine, all of those were actually the result originally, they're all derivations of original evolutionary pressures of dinosaurs starting to eat gymnosperms. The second thing gymnosperms had to do in order to get out of the way of grazing dinosaurs was grow tall. They started to grow straight up towards the air because of these organisms, what you guys would recognize probably as brontosauruses, but which are fancily known as sauropods, organisms with the longest necks ever in the animal kingdom, the tallest animals ever to reach. Gymnosperms enter into an arms race with sauropods, growing taller and taller and taller in order to put their leaves out of reach of these grazing dinosaurs. And eventually, they win. They become what is still today the tallest organisms on Earth. The two tallest organisms on Earth are the giant redwoods and the giant sequoias. Together, they can be anywhere from 200 to 300 feet tall, with their leaves all the way up in the forest canopies. Both of these are gymnosperms, cone plants, and both of these are wood trees that grew that tall, mostly because of the grazing pressures put together on sauropods. So we have lots of oxygen, changing the earth, physically making insects larger. And we also have lots of grazing, not only from insects, but also from dinosaurs, which causes the first plant defenses, poison sap, thorns, as well as the first wood to create those super, super tall trees that we now just think of as normal pine trees. The other advantage that allowed gymnosperms to be the most successful group of plants ever to exist on Earth is how they reproduce. They were the first organisms not only to reproduce using pollen, instead of just sperm swimming through water, but also to make seeds. Pollen is really important because pollen blows around in the air, in the wind. It doesn't need water, like the spores and like the sperm of ferns and bryophytes. So now for the first time, you have plant reproduction that just needs wind. It doesn't need water anymore, which pushes and allows gymnosperms to get even farther away from that super briny water and farther into areas that are even drier than even ferns could reach. And then you have this idea of seeds. Seeds are super important. Spores don't have protective coats. They don't have a seed coat. They don't have a food supply. Instead, they're just unicellular organisms. For the first time, conifers, gymnosperms, have seeds that are more than just cells. They have protection so they can survive harsher conditions. They have endosperm, cotyledons, on the inside of them that feeds that embryo and keeps it alive for years and in some cases even centuries. So that the gymnosperm seeds don't have to sprout in order to live. They can stay in perfect stasis basically forever, waiting for just the right time to sprout, just the right conditions where their embryos have the best chance of survival. That seed coat, that cotyledon, that's the food supply. And the cotyledons, like I say, feed the embryo very slowly. So together we go from plants that basically produce a whole bunch of single-celled things that have the potential of turning into a new plant, but 99.9999% of them don't land on exactly the right place at exactly the right time and they die. What we get here is we get seeds that no longer have to land at the right place at the right time. They can hold out. And so now not only do you have advantages of keeping yourself away from grazers, advantages of going even into drier areas of the earth, but now you're dropping seeds which can stay alive for prolonged periods of time and create new plants at just the right time, at just the right moment. All of this put together allowed gymnosperms to become what is in fact the most successful group of organisms ever at this time to ever live on Earth. There becomes more gymnosperms than any other organism ever on Earth up until this time. The gymnosperms that you're used to looking at, they're conifers, and absolutely they were around back then along with cycads and some other gymnosperms, evergreens. And if you look at a conifer today, a Christmas tree today, you'll notice some of these hallmark characteristics that these conifers have kept even since this time of the dinosaurs. Number one, all conifers have that piney smell. Well, that piney smell comes from resin, which help defend against insect attacks. As an insect bores into a conifer, it gets trudged down with all this sap, and it basically gets encapsulated in this sap. Why? Well, age of insects. These insects were huge, and they were all trying to bore into these trees, either for food or for protection, or in some cases just to eat the needles. Conifers also have needle leaves, and that's really important because needle leaves help conifers live in dry and cold environments. And for the first time, we have this idea: dry environments. Evergreens are the first trees that can truly live in dry environments. Ferns stayed relatively close to the waterline still. Yeah, there was dirt, but they still had kind of primitive roots, and they still needed to, like I say, stay close to the water. Bryophytes don't even have vascular tissue, so they basically need to stay wet all the time. For the first time now, you have plants that can live virtually anywhere on Earth because of their needle leaves, their tough needle leaves, protecting them in such dry, cold environments. And last but not least, they produce this wood. And this wood is what's called softwood. The reason it's called softwood is because if you look at the rings of this wood, you'll see that it's much farther spaced out than hardwood, maple or oak or that sort of thing. These are pine trees, softwood. These are broadleaf trees. And the difference is softwood plants don't drop their needles in the winter. They grow year-round, which causes a lot more growth to happen in a softwood or conifer. Hardwood is hard because it only grows for the summer when the plant has leaves. And as a result, the rings on a hardwood plant are much closer together. For the first time, conifers not only can exist in dry environments, but can grow huge and tall and big and old because they continually grow throughout the year. They don't grow in these stunts and stops like we're used to seeing with broadleaf trees. They're constantly photosynthesizing, constantly making new wood because they're not dropping their needles. So that's actually it. I know that was kind of quick, but, we basically got the main points in there, right? Earth changed because the first trees pumped lots of oxygen into the air. Yeah, this oxygen went down over time, but that initial spike of oxygen allows for the age of insects to take over. Also, it allows for trees to begin to grow tall. Tall trees stay out of the range of tall sauropods, defensive grazing dinosaurs. And so they can grow taller and keep their leaves for longer, as well as they have thorns, they have poison sap to discourage organisms from grazing on them. And above all else, gymnosperms become successful not only because of their defensive advantages, but because they're the first organisms to reproduce using pollen, which doesn't require water, and seeds, which can survive for a long period of time and not germinate until just the right time, giving the embryo the absolute best chance it has at survival. So that's it for gymnosperms, and next lesson I'll teach you about how angiosperms come in and they basically change virtually everything overnight, but that's next lesson, so there you go.